In the center of a small town on the banks of the Missouri River, where the silence is rarely disturbed by anything more than the rustle of the wind, lived two sisters, Amelia and Diane. From childhood, they were inseparable, and years later, fate divided them on different paths. Diane, the older and more ambitious, has always been the one who easily achieved everything she wanted. She married Trevor early, an attractive man with strong moral principles and unrivaled charisma. Together, they looked like a couple from a fashion magazine, perfect from every angle. Two charming children, a cozy house on the outskirts, and an impeccable reputation. Everything seemed perfect. Amelia, the younger sister, on the other hand, watched from the sidelines. Her life was a different scenario. She changed job after job, couldn't hold on to relationships, and always felt some inner emptiness. At 28, she was still living alone in a modest apartment in the center of the city. Loneliness was her constant companion, and the feeling only grew deeper with each passing year. She always tried to appear content, but with each meeting with Diane, envy was eating away at her from the inside. Diane didn't seem to notice anything. She was preoccupied with her business, her husband, her children, her friends, and parties. For her, life was full and busy. Amelia, on the other hand, felt the years were wasting away. She had no family, no one to fill the inner void, and even though Diane was her older sister, she had always treated Amelia with condescension, as if she were younger, almost like a child who had not yet found her way in life. And that condescension, mixed with good-naturedness and a slight arrogance, only made her feel more envious. Amelia hated her envy, but she couldn't help it. One cold fall evening, they met at a cafe where Diane had invited Amelia to chat. The conversation was as casual as it always was. Diane shared stories about her children, plans for the future, discussed Trevor and his successes at work. Her life seemed to be following a clear plan, impeccably calibrated. Amelia sat there, listening and smiling, but inside she was seething. She unbearably wanted something else. The sense of injustice, as if life had given her sister everything and her nothing, seemed intolerable. And though she had always tried not to show her envy, this time it was especially hard. After dinner, they went to Diane's car, and there Amelia met Trevor for the first time, not just as her sister's husband, but as a man who impressed her with his energy and attention. When he opened the car door for Diane and glimpsed Amelia, his smile seemed to linger on her for a moment. The look was so fleeting that no one would have paid it any mind. But in that brief moment, Amelia felt something strange. It wasn't just a look, it was some kind of electric tension. They exchanged a few meaningless phrases, and the evening ended like so many others. But in that moment, something changed. Not immediately, not overtly, but the jealousy that until that moment had been directed only at her sister now turned to Trevor as well. He was another symbol of what she didn't have. A caring, successful, strong man she'd never met in her life. A few weeks passed. Amelia returned to her usual days working part-time at the library, but that night continued to haunt her. Thoughts of Trevor, which she thought were absurd, kept her mind busy. She tried to push them away, to focus on something else, but it was no use. A chance encounter with him at the supermarket a few weeks later was the turning point she hadn't expected. Trevor was alone, and they started talking, as always, on neutral topics. But something in their conversation had changed. She could feel it. The stares became a little longer and the pauses a little longer. The words they exchanged were empty, but an invisible game had unfolded between them. Trevor seemed to be on the verge of saying something more, but each time he stopped. Amelia noticed these moments, feeling the tension boiling under her skin. Since then, these encounters had become more frequent. At first they had bumped into each other casually, but gradually they both began to look for reasons to see each other. Their conversations were almost innocent, but beneath the cover of those words lurked a growing affection. Amelia couldn't believe that a man who was married to her sister could be in any way interested in her. She fought the feeling, but it was too strong. Envy of her sister had taken it to a new level. Now it wasn't just envy of her life, it was a desire to possess what belonged to Diane. Every time Amelia saw Trevor lovingly hugging her sister or them spending time together, a fire of jealousy flared up in her. She felt that Trevor should have been with her, but even with these feelings, she realized that their romance was impossible. Another month passed. Amelia and Trevor continued to casually meet, and their connection became more and more apparent. They both knew it was wrong, but they couldn't stop. It was like a drug. The more they were around each other, the stronger their attraction to each other became. Trevor, who had seemed like such a proper and devoted husband, suddenly started acting completely different. He was experiencing a passion he hadn't felt with Diane in a long time. Amelia, immersed in this new world, realized she was going too far, but she couldn't stop. Every day spent without him seemed agonizing to her. She couldn't imagine her life without Trevor. Her sister, who used to be a close person to her, was now just a barrier to what she truly wanted. However, outwardly, they continued to play their roles. Amelia and Diane met as usual, at family dinners and celebrations, but the estrangement between them began to grow. Diane, though she didn't understand what was happening, intuitively sensed that Amelia was different. She put it down to her sister's personal problems, her unsettled life, but underneath it all, she was beginning to have troubling thoughts. Meanwhile, Trevor and Amelia continued their secret meetings. They didn't talk about the future or make plans, but every time they were together it seemed to last forever. The secret meetings between Amelia and Trevor became their inevitable routine. Each time they crossed paths, their attraction grew stronger and their passion became irresistible. At first it had been chance encounters, fleeting conversations at the supermarket, casual glances at family dinners. But gradually these meetings moved to a new level. They began to arrange dates. They were short, adrenaline-filled meetings where every look, every touch was drenched in passion and guilt. Amelia felt that she had finally found what she had always been looking for. Trevor had become the embodiment of something she had never had before, the assurance of love, care, and the feeling that she mattered. Every time they were alone together, Amelia lost her head, falling into this world of lies she had created for herself. She convinced herself that this was love, that it was more than just physical attraction. It was true passion, something that had seemed elusive to her all these years. But along with that passion, Amelia was beginning to feel the heaviness of their bond. With each new encounter, she realized that they were living in a world that could collapse at any moment. Every glance from Diane, every casual conversation reminded her that she was betraying her sister. But as soon as she and Trevor were together, all guilt dissolved. She forgot about everything but what she felt when he was around. Trevor, for his part, had mixed feelings as well. He couldn't deny that there was something about Amelia that drew him in. She was younger. Her energy was different than Diane, who he had been with for several years now. Amelia was a novelty in his life, a source of temptation he couldn't resist. But despite this, Trevor was full of contradictions. On the one hand, he knew he was betraying his wife, the woman he had built a family with. On the other hand, his passion for Amelia had become a necessity for him. Despite this, however, the tension grew each day. They met in secluded places where no one could see them. Amelia would often visit Trevor at work or set up meetings during his lunch breaks. Secrets became a part of their lives. They exchanged hidden messages, glances that no one but them could understand. Every moment with him was a gift to Amelia, but at the same time she felt she was building her world on a lie. She realized that their relationship could not last forever. Meanwhile, Diane began to notice changes in Trevor's behavior. At first it was small details. He started staying late at work more often. He sometimes seemed brooding. His habits began to change. Trevor was no longer the attentive husband she'd known him to be. He had become aloof, as if his thoughts were somewhere far away. Diane tried to ignore it, writing it off as work stress or fatigue, but the more time passed, the stronger her suspicions became. She sensed that something had changed in their relationship, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. Their conversations had become short, almost perfunctory. Trevor was becoming more and more withdrawn, and Diane caught herself thinking that she no longer knew what he was thinking. They were no longer what they used to be, that perfect couple who always understood each other half-heartedly. And it bothered her. One evening, when Trevor came home again later than usual, Diane tried to talk to him. She cautiously started with questions about work, trying to find out what was bothering him so much. But Trevor assured her that everything was fine, that he was just tired. His words didn't bring her relief, however. He was saying the right thing, but his eyes were saying the opposite. At that moment, Diane felt an acute sense of anxiety for the first time. Amelia, meanwhile, lived in two worlds. In one, she continued her relationship with her sister, constructing herself as a caring and attentive relative. They met often, drinking coffee, discussing news and plans for the future, but each time she found it harder and harder to look into Diane's eyes. She realized that their communication was a lie, that every day she was drifting away from her sister, who was the closest person in the world to her. Every time Amelia found herself with Trevor, she told herself that it was all temporary. She convinced herself that one day it would all be over, that they could go back to normal. But with each passing day, those thoughts became more and more elusive. She could no longer imagine her life without Trevor. It seemed to her that this feeling had taken over her completely, that she had lost control of herself. Trevor also felt that they had gone too far. He realized that this playing with fire couldn't go on forever. He began to wonder what would happen next. They couldn't hide forever, meeting in the shadows, fooling everyone around them. But despite all these thoughts, he couldn't bring himself to end his relationship with Amelia. She was something to him that he couldn't find in a marriage, and although he felt a deep sense of guilt towards Diane, his passion for Amelia was stronger. There came a point when their connection became so obvious that it became increasingly difficult to hide it. Amelia and Trevor increasingly felt that they could be watched. Every phone call or text carried the risk of exposure. They began to be cautious, choosing less conspicuous places to meet. Trevor began to avoid public places for fear that someone might see them together. One day, after a particularly passionate encounter in a hotel on the outskirts of the city, Trevor suddenly realized that he could no longer live in such tension. He realized that his relationship with Amelia was not only threatening his marriage, but also his life. He felt he was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. His thoughts wavered between his duty to his family and his passion for Amelia. He needed to make a decision. Amelia, on the other hand, couldn't accept that their affair might end. She had put all her feelings, all her hopes into this relationship. She was sure she had found love, the love she had been looking for so long. But the stronger her feelings became, the clearer she realized that Trevor couldn't leave his wife. She knew their relationship was doomed to fail, but she didn't want to believe it. Deep down, she hoped that Trevor would one day choose in her favor. Diane, meanwhile, couldn't shake her growing suspicions. Her intuition told her that Trevor was hiding something. She tried to find out the truth, but each time she ran into his confident excuses. Each day, however, her doubts grew stronger. Diane couldn't shake the feeling that their marriage was falling apart, and the reason lay somewhere deeper than just fatigue or work. Her inner world was beginning to crumble. Outwardly, she remained the same successful woman, wife, and mother, but inside she was growing anxious. She felt that Trevor was drifting away from her, that something was leaving forever. Diane didn't know how to get his attention back, didn't know how to deal with the fact that their relationship was no longer what it used to be. Her emotions were boiling up inside her, and she couldn't figure out how to handle the situation. All of this caused the tension in their home to reach a breaking point. Diane started asking more and more questions. Trevor was becoming more withdrawn, and Amelia, feeling trapped by her own feelings, didn't know how to get out of this situation. Their worlds were crumbling, and neither of them could guess how it would end. Trevor stood in front of the bathroom mirror, assessing his reflection. His face reflected more than just fatigue. It was an agonizing struggle with himself, an internal conflict he could no longer ignore. Every time he looked at himself, he felt the weight of his deception. The passion for Amelia that had gripped him for so long now seemed like a black pit into which he was sinking deeper and deeper, losing control of himself. Today was the day Trevor finally made his decision. He couldn't continue with these secret meetings, couldn't keep tearing his life apart between two women, one of whom was his wife, and the other was that wife's sister. He needed to end this once and for all. The problem wasn't just that they were betraying Diane, but that this relationship was destroying him from the inside out. He could no longer cope with the growing guilt. Every morning when he woke up next to Diane, He felt like he had betrayed not only her, but himself. His hands shook as he turned off the water and wiped his face with a towel. Tonight he planned to meet with Amelia and tell her what he should have said long ago. This has to end. But how? How would he say it to the woman who had invested her hopes and feelings in him? Amelia had grown too attached to him, and he had let her believe they had a future. He realized that meeting her would not go smoothly. She wouldn't make this decision easily, but there was no other choice. Amelia, on the other hand, was preparing for this meeting with completely different expectations. She had sensed a strange tension in Trevor for days now, his aloofness. But she had convinced herself that it was only a temporary hardship. She couldn't believe that Trevor was capable of leaving her. He was more than just a lover to her. He was the one she loved most in the world. Amelia hoped that this meeting would only help them strengthen their relationship, make it more explicit. Maybe Trevor would finally decide to tell Diane everything. When Trevor arrived for the meeting, he felt a heavy emptiness inside. Their meeting place was familiar, a secluded, quiet alley in the park where the trees hid them from view. He had chosen this place specifically so that no one could see them. The place where they had exchanged passionate kisses more than once now seemed almost ghostly to him. Amelia was already waiting for him, sitting on one of the benches. When Trevor got out of the car, she immediately realized that something was wrong. His gait was slow, his gaze heavy, as if he were going to his own execution. Something shivered inside her, but she didn't want to show it. She hoped it was just a play of his fatigue, that soon they would be able to discuss the future and find a way out together. "Hi," Amelia said, standing up and walking over to him. She wanted to hug him, but Trevor took a step back, avoiding her touch. It was the first warning, but Amelia ignored it. "We need to talk." His voice sounded muffled, almost devoid of life. He lowered his gaze, not daring to look her in the eye. Amelia frowned, the tension inside her growing. She knew that this kind of talk never led to good things, but she still hoped that this was just a temporary difficulty they could overcome. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was full of anxiety, though she tried to remain calm. Trevor sighed as if preparing for a hard confession. "Amelia, this can't go on. We have to stop. I can't live like this anymore." The words came out of him with sudden harshness. He felt as if he was throwing off a heavy weight, but there was no relief, only emptiness. Amelia froze as an icy current ran through her body. Her thoughts raced, unable to believe what she had just heard. "What?" She took a step toward him, desperation in her eyes. "You can't be serious. We love each other." Trevor clenched his jaw, avoiding Amelia's gaze. He knew his every word was hurting her, but it was impossible to go on like this. "This is a mistake," he said quietly. "We should never have started this. I betrayed my wife, and you too." Those words seemed to knock Amelia off her feet. She couldn't believe that Trevor was giving up everything they had. She felt her anger rising in her, mixed with pain and despair. "A mistake?" she hissed, raising her voice. "You call this a mistake? What we went through, what you told me, it was all a lie?" Trevor tried to take her hand, but Amelia pushed him away with a force that surprised them both. "Amelia, understand." He tried to speak more calmly. "I love Diane. I can't keep lying to her, and I can't keep lying to myself." She couldn't hear it. Everything inside her was boiling. How could he? How could he stand in front of her and talk about loving Diane, after everything that had happened between them? She felt like she was losing control, that her emotions were overwhelming her. She lunged at Trevor, slapping him on the chest. "You don't dare!" she screamed. "You can't just leave everything behind! Not after all this! You promised me! You said you loved me!" Trevor grabbed her arms tightly, trying to stop her, but Amelia couldn't calm down. She thrashed in his arms, her face contorted with rage. Everything crumbled for her in an instant. All her dreams, her hopes, her whole life. It all turned out to be a lie. Trevor tried to speak, but his voice drowned in Amelia's anger. She wasn't listening anymore. Her world had crumbled, and she blamed it all on him. This man she had trusted with her heart now stood before her like a traitor who had destroyed everything she had built in her head for so long. For a moment, Amelia stopped, breathing heavily. A mixture of pain and hatred splashed in her eyes. She took a step back, looking at Trevor as if seeing him for the first time. "You're not leaving me," she said coldly, her voice filled with icy determination. "If you leave me, you'll lose everything. I will tell Diana everything. I will destroy your life, Trevor." Her words sent shivers through him. He knew she was capable of it, but something in her tone made him feel it was more than a threat. In that moment, he realized that Amelia was ready to go all the way. "Amelia," he began, trying to find words that might calm her down, but it was too late. She wasn't listening anymore. Her face contorted with anger, she turned and walked away, leaving him alone in the dark alley. Trevor remained standing still, watching her walk away. His heart was pounding in his chest, and his mind was racing with thoughts. He didn't know what would happen next, but he felt that something terrible had just happened, that their lives would never be the same again. Later that night, when everything seemed more or less calm, a terrible incident occurred. A sound was heard in the quiet and deserted house that would later ruin the lives of everyone involved in this drama. The murder happened quickly, in the darkness, when no one expected the blow. The streets were empty, the night wind blew quietly, and no one knew that someone's life had been cut short that evening. It was as if everything around them was frozen, waiting for the truth that would soon come out. The silence of the sunny morning was broken by the sound of sirens. Police cars, bright in the light of the rising sun, stood in front of Trevor and Diane's house. The place that yesterday had seemed the epitome of quiet family bliss was now surrounded by police officers, detectives, and forensic scientists, scrutinizing every corner for clues. In the kitchen was the smell of last night's dinner, which now seemed to belong to another life. The entire house was enveloped in an icy silence, broken only by the footsteps of those who had gathered to find out exactly what had happened here. Trevor lay in the bedroom, his body having been found early that morning by Diane, who had called the police in a state of shock. When Detective Joshua Carter entered the house, he immediately noticed the tense atmosphere enveloping the place. With his experienced eye, he quickly assessed the surroundings, trying to pick up on every detail that could lead him to an understanding of what had happened. Joshua was known for his intuitive approach to investigations that seemed almost mystical at times. He could see things that eluded others, and this case was no exception. Examining Trevor's body lying on the bed, he immediately realized that there was more to it than that. The official conclusion, a blow to the head with a heavy object, seemed obvious, but something about the situation kept the detective on his toes. "Who found the body?" he asked, turning to one of the officers who was already collecting statements. "The wife, Diane Reed," the officer replied. "She came home this morning and found him. Says she was at her friend's house for a late-night meeting." Joshua frowned upon hearing that. Suspicion always began to fall on the next of kin, especially when it came to marriage. He knew Diane would be his first suspect, but his gut told him the case could be much more complicated than that. After surveying the scene, he made his way to the living room where Diane was sitting. She was sitting on the couch with her hands clasped tightly around her knees, her eyes unfocused and her face pale. She was clearly struggling to comprehend what had happened, and she looked so distressed she could barely speak. "Miss Reed, I'm Detective Carter. We realize this is a difficult time for you, but I need to ask you some questions," Joshua began, taking a seat across from her. Diane looked up, their eyes meeting for a moment. There was confusion, fear, and something else in her eyes. Joshua couldn't quite put his finger on what it was, but he knew the woman was hiding something. "Can you tell me where you were last night?" he asked. "Yeah, I was at my friend's house, Megan," she whispered, barely audible. "We met last night and talked until late last night. Then I stayed the night at her place. I came back this morning and found him." Her voice shook, but Joshua sensed some unnatural coldness in her words. She seemed to be trying to convince not only him, but herself as well. Detective Carter took notes, but something about her demeanor kept him on his toes. He paused, watching Diane's reaction carefully before continuing. "Would Megan be able to confirm your alibi?" he asked, and Diane nodded. "Yes, of course, we were together all night," she said in a more confident voice, as if trying to reinforce her version of events. Joshua wrote it down in his notebook and stood up. "Thank you, Miss Reed. We'll be in touch with you again. If you need any assistance, let our officers know." As he walked out of the house, His thoughts were filled with new questions. Diane's alibi seemed convincing, but something didn't add up. It felt like some unspoken secret. Carter felt that this was just the tip of the iceberg and didn't want to jump to conclusions. Meanwhile, Amelia sat in her home, curled up on the couch, clutching her cell phone in her hands. Her fingers trembled, and her mind raced randomly. When she'd learned of Trevor's death, her world had crumbled. She felt her time was running out, that the truth about her relationship with Trevor was about to surface. She was gripped with dread, afraid of what the investigation might lead to her. She didn't know how to act, what to say if she was asked about Trevor. The love she had felt for him had now turned into a source of fear and despair. Every minute she expected a call or a visit from the police. She knew she had to keep calm and stay in the shadows, but it was incredibly difficult to do so. A hurricane of emotions was raging inside her. Amelia couldn't even imagine how this could have happened. Just yesterday they had met Trevor, and although he had tried to break off the relationship, she didn't believe it was over. She'd thought she could convince him, make him come back to her. But now he was gone, and she was left to wonder who could have done it. Was it really Diane? Or was it someone else? Anxiety grew by the hour. She remembered every detail of their last encounter, his cold words, her anger, their fight. It all seemed distant, and yet so close at the same time. But most importantly, she realized that the police would start asking questions, and she needed to be prepared for the possibility that her affair with Trevor might come to light. She couldn't afford to panic. Her instinct told her that she had to stay in the shadows, no matter how hard it was. The next morning, Joshua Carter continued his investigation. He talked to Megan, Diane's friend, who confirmed her alibi. But something about that alibi seemed too perfect to Joshua. Diane acted as if she had prepared for this issue in advance. Perhaps she really wasn't guilty, but Carter knew that no detail should be overlooked in such matters. He decided to study Trevor's entourage to see if there was anyone else who might have wanted him dead. In conversations with Trevor's friends and co-workers, some details surfaced that could prove important. In particular, co-workers mentioned that Trevor had seemed tense lately and something was bothering him. No one knew what the cause was, but several people noticed that he had started to avoid talking about his family. Joshua also discovered that Trevor had canceled plans with Diane repeatedly in recent weeks, which supported the theory of tension in their marriage. It could have been a common family problem, but when it came to crimes, little things mattered. As Joshua studied the details of Trevor and Diane's lives, another figure caught his attention: Amelia, Diane's younger sister. Amelia's name had come up several times in their conversations about the family, but each time in passing, as if no one wanted to discuss her. This alerted Joshua. He began to realize that perhaps there was something darker lurking behind the facade of a perfect marriage. He made the decision to talk to Amelia to see if she might know something about the tension between Trevor and Diane. The move seemed logical. Often, close family members can reveal details that go unnoticed to outsiders. When he arrived at Amelia's house, she looked surprised to see him, but couldn't hide her tension. Joshua noticed it immediately, her nervous movements, her avoidance of direct gaze. He sensed she had something to hide, but he didn't know what it was yet. "Miss Reed," he began as soon as they were seated in the living room. "Were you close to Trevor?" Amelia looked at him in surprise, as if she hadn't expected such a question. "We were just friends." Amelia froze as she answered. The words came out of her lips automatically, as if she had prepared for the question beforehand. But her eyes betrayed a worry that Joshua couldn't help but notice. Her hands clenched nervously into fists, and her gaze dropped to the floor. The detective knew instantly that she was hiding something. "Just friends," he repeated, leaning forward. "So you talk to each other a lot?" "Sometimes. We'd see each other at family events. He was a good man." Trevor took care of Diana. Amelia's voice began to waver, clearly struggling with her own conflict, trying to stay calm, but her emotions were taking over. Joshua knew that pushing her right now would be a mistake. Instead, he decided to take a softer approach. "I understand this is a difficult time for you. Loss is always painful, especially when it comes to loved ones. I just want to understand if there was someone who might have had reason to hurt him." His voice was soft, almost sympathetic, But Amelia still felt on edge. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to gather her strength. They'll find out sooner or later, she thought. But the thought of the truth about her affair with Trevor coming out made her dreadful. If that happened, she would lose everything: her sister's respect, her reputation, and possibly her freedom. She had to live with the guilt every day, but to admit it in front of a detective? Her world would come crashing down. "I don't know," she barely audibly squeezed out, trying to hide the tremor in her voice. "He never talked about enemies." Joshua scrutinized her face, noting every detail. There was something unnatural in her demeanor. Amelia was clearly scared, but that fear seemed too deep for simple friendship. He sensed that there was more to her and Trevor than that. But it would take time to get her to come clean. "Thank you, Amelia. If you think of anything, don't hesitate to contact me. Sometimes the little things can be important," Joshua said, rising slowly from his seat. Amelia walked him to the door, and as soon as it closed, her heart raced with renewed vigor. She didn't have time. She had to think of something before the detective dug deeper. Joshua Carter sat in his car and thought for a moment. Her answer seemed inadequate. He'd seen too many cases not to notice the nervous tics, the evasive looks, the overly memorized phrases. Something connected Amelia and Trevor, and he was sure it wasn't just friendship. On the way to the station, he pondered where to start. He needed to conduct a series of interviews, investigate Trevor's personal and work contacts, and recheck Diane's alibi. The night before the murder was beginning to look more and more confusing. Megan, Diane's friend, was scheduled to meet with him again to clarify her statement, and Amelia was possibly the key to the mystery. When Joshua returned to the station, his partner, Detective Sarah Miller, was already waiting for him with the first reports. "Our forensics team has completed their analysis of the crime scene," she said, reviewing the paperwork. There were no signs of forced entry, but there were signs of a struggle in the bedroom. This wasn't just a murder due to robbery or sudden anger. Joshua picked up the report and delved deeper into the reading. There was a suspicion that Trevor knew his killer. What's more, the killer acted out of passion. The marks on the body show that the blows were delivered with great force, and there may have been more than one. "It's not a professional murder, but a case of personal motives," Sarah continued. Carter nodded, sinking into thought. More and more details were pointing to the fact that this crime could have been due to emotional turmoil rather than something more prosaic. "What about Diane's alibi?" he asked, turning the pages of the report. "Megan confirms that they spent the whole night together," Sarah said. "But there are some minor discrepancies. For example, she claims Diane left around 6 in the morning, but Diane herself said she was home by 8. Those 2 hours remain empty for now." "We need to delve deeper into this matter," Joshua said, putting the report aside. "I also want to talk to Amelia again. She's hiding something. I can feel it." Sarah raised her eyebrows. "Sister? Do you think she might have a motive?" "I don't know yet," he answered. But her reaction to the questions was too nervous. "We need to find out how close she and Trevor were." Joshua went back to his desk and made a couple of calls, planning the next steps of the investigation. Soon his phone rang. It was the medical examiner reporting the results of the autopsy. "Joshua, we've got something interesting. Turns out Trevor was poisoned before he was hit on the head. We found traces of a potent substance in his blood that causes temporary paralysis. He couldn't defend himself." The detective stopped in mid-motion, realizing that this discovery changes the whole picture. Someone had prepared this murder in advance, and the motive was probably more than just a flash of anger. The planning of the poisoning and subsequent hit pointed to something much more elaborate. Now Joshua had 2 questions. Who could have poisoned Trevor, and how to connect this to the possible family drama that was unfolding before his eyes? She couldn't shake the thought that her connection to Trevor was about to be revealed. Her fear was heightened when she heard from mutual acquaintances that the police already suspected Diane. Amelia knew that if her relationship with Trevor became public, Diane wouldn't forgive her, but worst of all, she could be charged with murder. She sat in her small apartment, replaying the events of that fateful night in her head. What if someone had seen her and Trevor in the last few days? What if her sister knew about the affair? Amelia couldn't answer these questions, but one thing was certain: she was standing on the edge of a precipice. A sudden knock on the door brought her back to reality. Amelia froze, looking around in fear. She slowly approached the door, listening. Quiet footsteps sounded behind her. The knocking was repeated. "Amelia, it's Joshua Carter. We need to talk." The detective's voice came from behind the door. Her heart beat faster. Carter was out there, and that meant only one thing. Her secret was no longer safe. Joshua Carter stood in front of Amelia's apartment, holding his breath. He knew that tonight's meeting would change everything. He'd developed a clear picture of what had happened over the past few days, but he had to listen to the final confessions to put together the last pieces of this dark puzzle. The knock came again, and Amelia finally peeked through the door. Her face was a mixture of surprise and fear that she couldn't hide. Carter noticed her eyes glancing sideways, as if she were trying to hide something in the room. "Amelia, we need to talk. It's very important," he said, motioning for her to come inside. She nodded silently and stepped aside, allowing him to enter the small living room. The furniture was minimalist but cozy. There seemed to be silence and solitude. Carter sat down across from her, tucking his notebook into his pocket. This was not a moment for taking notes. Tonight, he needed to see her true face. "Amelia, I know the last few days have been difficult for you." The detective began in a soft but insistent tone. "And I realize you've been hiding a lot of things. I'd like you to tell me your side of the story. It's important. It's important to you." She leaned back on the couch as if under the weight of the words. Minutes of silence stretched on, as if an unbearably long silence filled the room. Amelia gathered her thoughts, took a few deep breaths, and finally her voice came out quietly, almost muffled. "I didn't think it would go this far." Carter didn't interrupt her. Her words began to flow out smoothly, like water from a broken vessel. "I've always felt like an extra in the family ever since I was a little girl." Her voice shook, and her eyes ran nervously around the room. Diane was perfect. She always had everything: friends, success, parental attention. I, on the other hand, was always just a shadow of her perfect life. "And you were jealous of her," Carter said carefully, looking into her face. Amelia paused for a moment, then nodded, as if those words relieved her soul. "Yes, I was jealous, but it was more than envy. It was rage, an injustice that was eating me up inside. I looked at her happy life with Trevor and thought, why not me? Why do I have to be the one that no one notices?" "You started a relationship with Trevor," Carter continued, leading her gently. "Yes," Amelia answered quietly. "We met in secret and I felt important. He was more than just a lover to me. He was something that finally belonged to me, not Diana. This was my chance to feel first, special." Her voice became harsher, and a note of desperation began to creep in. Joshua noticed the strange emotion in her eyes, as if she was completely immersed in her thoughts, losing touch with reality. "But then he decided to end it all," she continued, her face contorted with anger. "He said he wanted to go back to Diana, that it was a mistake. And I couldn't let him do that. I couldn't let him go back to her, like I didn't mean anything again." Her breathing quickened, and her voice grew louder and more strained. Carter sensed she was on edge. "And then you poisoned him?" he questioned, looking directly into her eyes. Amelia froze, her gaze frozen for a moment, then she covered her face with her hands as if trying to hide from the world. "I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered through her tears. "I just wanted him with me. I found a poison that would make him weak, so he couldn't leave. But when I saw him faint, yeah." Her hands trembled and she raised them, as if trying to portray something that was too difficult to put into words. "I hit him," she said faintly. "It was impulsive. I wasn't in control. In that moment, it all became real. I realized I couldn't live in Diane's shadow anymore. I couldn't let her win again." Carter nodded. Everything was falling into place. This wasn't cold-blooded murder, but it wasn't a crime of instant anger either. It was a mixture of unresolved childhood trauma, jealousy, and morbid obsession. "You knew it would come out sooner or later," he said quietly. "You knew it wouldn't be without consequences." Amelia looked up, her eyes full of despair. "I thought I could hide it. I hoped no one would guess. I thought I could live with it. But it's impossible. Her voice shook, and she sighed convulsively. Carter was silent for a long moment, letting her sink into her thoughts. This moment was both a release and a punishment for her. "Diane didn't deserve this," he continued, "and neither did Trevor. Their lives are ruined because of your desire to escape the shadows, but the truth always comes out. You couldn't stay in that lie forever." Amelia nodded, her face pale, as if she had realized all her actions and their consequences. She no longer resisted, no longer made excuses. "I've lived in her shadow for so long," she said, almost in a whisper. "I thought that if I took something from her, it would make me happy. But it never worked." Carter stood up, pulling out his handcuffs. He knew this encounter had concluded his investigation. A story that seemed confusing and complicated at first glance boiled down to one simple truth. Amelia's shattered psyche couldn't bear the burden of jealousy, despair, and hatred. "Amelia Brown, you're under arrest for the murder of Trevor Hastings. Anything you say can be used against you in a court of law," he said formally as he cuffed her wrists. She did not resist. Her face was calm, as if the confession had finally brought her relief. Carter led her out of the apartment, and they headed to the station. The day Amelia confessed was a turning point for everyone. Diane, grief-stricken and feeling betrayed, couldn't recover for a long time. Her life, which had seemed perfect, fell apart overnight. She lost her husband and sister in an instant. She couldn't believe the man she'd always supported would do such a thing. For Joshua, the case was a reminder of how deeply human emotions and trauma can hide. Sometimes behind the prosperous facades are stories full of pain, jealousy, and despair. Amelia went to prison, where a long sentence awaited her. But for her, the punishment began long before that. The moment she allowed her mind to become a prisoner of an obsession to possess something that never belonged to her.